So it's Max Verstappen on the pole for the sprint race at Imola on Saturday afternoon. That kind of translates into more points if you do well in the sprint race, and obviously a better starting position for the big Grand Prix on Sunday. The Imola circuit, again, hosting Formula One. Wonderful to be back there. Obviously, bittersweet memories of it at Imola, always have been. But nonetheless, for Ferrari fans, for the Tifosi, it is a weekend of expectation. Not quite the day they wanted, of course, but Charles Leclerc is up there in P2 behind Max Verstappen, who has the pole for the sprint race. And I think, speaking, I guess, cynically, I used to work for Ferrari, and I was there at Imola in '82 when the two Ferrari drivers with race-winning cars were out there at the front of the Grand Prix, and there was a lot of worry at the time about fuel consumption and everything else. And it was agreed that, as you probably know this story, it was agreed that if they were leading by a certain amount, then whoever was in front would take the cars through to the checkered flag. And that driver was Gilles Villeneuve. And Didier Pironi, his teammate, desperate to win in front of his home crowd at Imola. And with quite a lot of the Ferrari management behind him, Marco Piccinini, particularly the team manager, kept passing Gilles every time Gilles backed off and eventually won the Grand Prix. I was there, as I say, and I remember sprinting up to Parc Fermé as Gilles got out of the car, and I was kind of alone, and Gilles got out of the car, took his helmet off, and I've never seen him so upset in my life. Obviously, that's an image that will always stay with me. And I say all that because here we are, Ferrari, two cars, two drivers, very quick drivers, leading the World Championship. Charles Leclerc has the momentum at the moment, but a lot of field behind Carlos Sainz. He's just signed a new contract through to 2024. Fresh engine for San Marino. Nothing like a fresh engine in front of your home crowd as well. That's because partly of the issues we saw in Australia getting the thing started. So yeah, a lot behind Carlos Sainz going into this Grand Prix. And my my thought was that if these two guys qualify at the front, which they're quite capable of doing, or should have been, then it was going to be interesting to see how Ferrari were going to manage this race, because it would be difficult to say to Carlos, if he felt he was slightly quicker than Charles, but in P2, stay there, Carlos. And I don't think he would have. And I think we could have potentially got into another political fracas. But that's not going to happen now. Well, it probably won't happen. Mind you, we've got to get through the sprint race yet to get to the Grand Prix. But at the moment, it's not going to happen because Carlos Sainz made a massive mistake. Another big mistake, got to say, under pressure. And it kind of underlines, I don't want to keep saying, told you so, but it kind of underlines everything I've always been saying about Carlos, which is that he's incredibly quick, phenomenal car control, quite spiky with his inputs. He's never really changed that. I think we saw, I mentioned in Melbourne that he looked more harmonious in the car, and I think generally he's heading in the right direction. But when it comes down to pressure points, and you've really got to sort of put your brain in neutral and just drive on feel, he's still got this problem. And we saw that today. Beginning of Q2, there was rain coming, big dark clouds in the background. It had been raining in the morning, so we knew it was potentially going to rain again. And Ferrari even knew that it was going to rain into the first three turns of the circuit. And so the radio was saying to Carlos and to Charles, push, keep pushing. A lot of pressure. And this is on the back of Q1. I just got to look at the times here. Q1, very impressive performance by Charles Leclerc, 18.7. First time we'd seen the cars out in the dry on soft tyres. 18.7 Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz 19.3. He knew that, I'm sure he was convinced that he could do an 18.6, 18.5, and he was out there doing it and just lost it on the second last corner, which I think is turn 18, right at the bottom of the hill, with the lap behind him, basically. It was just the two left-handers and then just accelerating down to the straight. And that, to me, is a driver who doesn't put sectors 1 and 2, two very good sectors, behind him in the bank. Just focus on sector 3, do everything correctly, brake at the right place, don't make any silly errors. There's not a lot you can do on those two corners. Yes, obviously you want good traction, but more than anything, you want patience to get the traction absolutely right. And he just gave it too much throttle. It's the double apex left-hander. And the first left-hander just gave it too much throttle when the car was almost straight, too abruptly, lost the back end, and he was off. And that red flagged the session. So I don't want to be too confusing about this, but that was just to say, so Carlos Sainz out of Q2 2 effectively and will start P10 when he could have been starting front row of the grid, if not pole position, yet again. And in this occasion, he cannot say it was because I was laid out of the garage or anything happened like that. He just made a massive mistake. I say under pressure. So, and that highlights that flaw he still has in his driving. This last bit of suppleness right on the edge of a thousandth of a second under pressure. And that's what Charles Leclerc does so well. When the pressure's off, Leclerc makes as many mistakes as anybody out there. Well, not Nicholas Latifi probably, but almost that many. So yeah, and that left Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen in a shootout. It had rained, but by the time they went out at the beginning of Q3, it was intermediates, but it wasn't, as Charles said on his opening, it wasn't quite, and Max said actually, it wasn't quite as wet as he thought it was going to be. So let's now have a look at what happened in Q3. You can see there the lap times. Max did 2 very quick laps, or I say quick laps. I mean, 28.7 would have been good for the pole or the front row, and then he did that 27.9. So he did the 28.7. And look at, these are 3 sector times: 28.3, sector 1, 29.7, sector 2, 30.6, sector 3. And the number in brackets is what he did through the speed trap at the end of, or towards the end of sector 3. It's down the hill before the corner where Carlos Sainz went. So 280 kilometers an hour. And I put that in because on his next lap, this was the pole lap, 27.9, incredible lap in intermediates when you look at what Charles was doing. 27.6 sector 1, that's why he got that pole, sector 1. Now the visual difference through that sector is Ferrari still bouncing a lot, even on intermediates, with spray coming out from the back of the car, and the Red Bull looking incredibly stable certainly into turns 1, 2, 3, down towards Tosa, looking bounce free. I would suggest that's one of the reasons that Sector 1 is so good for Max Verstappen. After qualifying, Charles Leclerc said, well, we messed it up. We didn't get it quite right, which translated, I think, means he didn't get the tyre temperature warming correct. And that's probably also a factor. If you're very slow in Sector 1, it's usually because you haven't got the tyres up to temperature at the right rate, or deliberately haven't got the tyres up to temperature. And maybe that's what they planned to do, but it didn't work out. So 28.8, Charles Leclerc, Sector 1, 27.6, more or less at the same time, Max Verstappen. That's where that pole came from. 29.7, both of them the same through Sector 2, which is the twiddly bit, Acqua Minerale. Got to say, Acqua Minerale, the approach to Acqua Minerale now, down the hill, is, I've got to say another thing about Imola, which I always love about Imola. You go through Tosa, the tight left-hander, you go up the hill, then there's a left-hander. And that left-hander is a quick corner. It's an interesting corner. It's at the top of the hill. You approach it kind of blind. It's pretty quick. But I've never seen anybody go off there, ever. I've been going to Imola since 79, I think? Yeah, 79, non-championship race, which Nicky won. And I've never seen anybody go off there. And I often wonder, because it's a left-hander, or what is it? Or it's because it's quite quick, and I don't know. It's just an amazing thing. Anyway, they go through the left-hander, down the hill, but plenty of people go off into Acqua Minerale, and plenty of people did today. Lando Norris, Valtteri Bottas, and that's because there's a right kink before they hit the brakes. But when the track was wet, the kink was as they hit the brakes. So it was a really interesting bit of road where they had to apply the brakes with and find a little area where they can get the car stopped flat without braking with load on it. And every time you brake with load on it or caught a curb, you were gone. So it was a really interesting bit of road. Anyway, through there, Charles and Max were fabulous on their good laps. As you can see, 29.7 for both of them. And then Sector 3 comes along, and Valtteri Bottas goes off, coming out of the top chicane, coming out of the chicane, hits the guardrail. And by the time Max is there, the yellow is flashing, and he's probably thinking, I've just driven this amazing Sectors 1 and 2, the lap's gone. So you can hear him back off. And in terms of that lap, he does back off. And you can see there now, 30.5 for Sector 3, and that 238 kilometers an hour does reflect how much he'd backed off by the time he got to the speed trap. He's going much slower. But look at this, I put in, 30.1 was what Charles Leclerc did on his quickest lap. Max 30.5, and he's actually still quicker in Sector 3 than he was on his previous quickest lap. So I think he was quite lucky. I mean, obviously they're going to look at the telemetry and say, yeah, he did back off. That's fair enough. But if you look at that, it's, he's right on the edge because he's actually quicker when the yellows are out through sector 3 than he was on his previous quick lap. And look at Lando Norris on his 29.1. He did a 30.9 sector 3. Admittedly, he was right behind Bottas when Bottas had that shunt. So he probably backed off a bit on that one. 28.9, I would imagine. But nonetheless, 30.9 for sector 3 with the yellow or with the shunt just in front of him, compared with Max Verstappen 30.5 with the yellow flashing. So I think Max was a little bit lucky there. And maybe I'm the only person saying that. Nobody seemed to be talking about that after qualifying. But, I still think an absolute... I mean, you can look at it another way and say, look, he did a 30.5, 238 kilometers an hour through the trap, and he still did a 27.9. Unbelievable. That's what you could say. That's what I am saying, really. I think amazing lap. But I think he's right on the edge of... But I would, wouldn't we all do the same? You've just done that amazing sector 1 and 2, or sector 1 particularly, and the yellow comes, and you can see that it's Bottas and he's stopped. You're going to back off a bit, but you're not going to kill the lap, are you? So congratulations to Max. And I think here, in those wet conditions, semi-wet, whatever you want to call them, they're on intermediates. I think when they did that time, I think it's, that's where not having any bouncing probably makes a difference more than people think. And that could well have been the difference between the Red Bull and the Ferrari today. But Charles, Charles right there, isn't he? He's right there next to Max going into the first corner for the sprint race. It'll be interesting to see how those two face off going into that turn 1, because we've seen before what happens if you get a run. It's long enough to be able to get a toe. And if Charles out here somewhere and Max is sort of holding the racing line on the inside, it's going to, presumably Charles will back away, but it's going to be... And I've got Valtteri's Alpha back to the pits, and congrats here again to Valtteri. Very good job by the Alpha team. I've got to say, Guan Yu Zhou, unbelievably, was P4 in Q1. 19.7, Carlos Sainz 19.3, Sergio Perez 19.7, Kevin Magnussen 20.1, Lando Norris 20.1, Fernando Alonso 20.1, Guan Yu Zhou 19.7 in the Alpha. So anyway, they got rid of the mess of the Alpha and they went out, and there was just time to do one quick lap, but it was much wetter now and it was difficult, and they were all on intermediates again. Max said out of the pits, it's not quite as wet as I thought it was going to be. And he got through sector 1, but it was considerably slower. He did a 29.1, I think it was, through sector 1, right at the end. And then another red happened, and it was Lando Norris who went off, brought it all to a halt. He's probably quite pleased, I would imagine, because, and Zach would have been quite pleased, because it's consolidated his P3, which he'd earned with that really good lap at the beginning of Q3. So very, very good performance yet again from Lando Norris. He really is a class act as a driver, and he's just getting better all the time. And he knows, like Charles, like Lewis, he knows when to push and when not to push, and when to be quick and when not to be quick. Because this was not a bad weekend so far. Hasn't been a bad weekend so far for Daniel Ricciardo, but he's out there right at the end, just blitzing him. And if you look at the lap times, 29.1, Daniel 29.7. You could say, oh well, Daniel's only 0.6 slower, but 0.6 is actually a lot in the world of Daniel Ricciardo. Just talking about that, I'll just go through the teammates and how they stacked up against one another in the dry, which was, I guess, because in the wet there are so many variables, so many red flags. Have you got the tyres up to temperature? It's more difficult to do the comparison. But there was this moment coming out of Q1 when we could see the differences between the teammates on the soft tyre, and it was the only real feel we've had for anything really. So far today it's been a bit scrappy. But there was 0.2 between the Ferrari drivers, again about what you'd expect. There was that bigger gap, but that was before Charles had done his quick lap time. So if you took the quickest time they'd done in the dry, there was 0.2 in it, and that was about right, I would say. Charles 0.2 quicker than Carlos Sainz. Lando Norris versus Daniel Ricciardo, 0.7 actually. It wasn't even 0.2, it was 0.7 of a second, and that's quite a lot, isn't it? Fernando Alonso blitzed Esteban Ocon. That's only because Ocon seemed to have some sort of drama all day, didn't even get out of Q1, so it doesn't really mean much. But got to say, Fernando Alonso did a very good job, and he'll be starting the sprint race from P5 in the Alpine. So good job, Fernando, for Fernando. He had a few moments as well, Aqua Minerale, to name but one. Kevin Magnussen over Mick Schumacher, half a second in the end, in the dry, if you took the best they'd done. And that, very impressive, I think, from Mick Schumacher. Very good from Kevin as well. In fact, you've got to say, Kevin Magnussen is a quick racing driver. There's no doubt about that. And for Mick to be doing that time, half a second slow around Imola, not only says a lot about the Haas and the Ferrari input and the Dallara input, but also how Mick Schumacher is improving and how good he is. I've always rated Mick. I mean, there was a time when he was doing F3, and I remember when he started to win a lot of races, and a lot of people at the time said, "Oh, for sure he's getting illegal engines and this and that, lightweight car, whatever." And that's when I started to watch Formula 3 for a bit, actually, and I was really impressed with the way he drove and his approach and his attitude, and very pleased to see that I was right, really. I think he is good. I don't know how good, but he's very good. He's very, very good. And if he was in a Ferrari, which I suggested a couple of years ago, very good teammate for Charles Leclerc, bring him up slowly. Or quickly, I guess. He's in a Ferrari. But if he was Charles Leclerc's teammate, I think he'd be quite capable of doing at least the job of Sergio Perez against Max Verstappen. That's how good I think he is. Sebastian Vettel, Lance Stroll, 0.4 between the two in the end, in the dry. Again, what that says, Aston Martin actually finding this circuit a little bit better for them, and Sebastian Vettel doing a slightly better job, a considerably better job than he did in Melbourne, because Lance Stroll was quite quick on occasion. So in fact, when they stopped Q1 right at the beginning, he was actually P1 at that moment. So that's not bad for Aston Martin, and it's about where the drivers should be. Valtteri Bottas, Guanyu Zhou, 0.4 between them in the end, but very good performance by both drivers, I thought. And George Russell, 0.1 quicker than Lewis Hamilton. Lewis won't like that. I'm sure that he was carrying another sensor or whatever, and it was a few grams or whatever. There must be something in it. I'm saying that, I hope so, kind of. Only because Lewis is so good, and we know how good he is. And it's a difficult situation for him now because, as I said right at the start of the year, before the whole thing started, George is only going to be interested in one thing: out-qualifying Lewis Hamilton. And if he can, if the conditions are right, out-racing him. And every time he out-qualifies him, that's George Russell looking really good and doing his job. And it doesn't really matter whether it's P10, P5, P3, P15. It doesn't really matter, does it? He's quicker than Lewis Hamilton. From George Russell's point of view, that's all that matters. And he can do interviews and say, "Oh yeah, Lewis is the captain of the ship," or "He's this," or "He's that." And of course he's going to say that, because the more he says that, the better it looks for George Russell. Nothing against that at all. It's totally appropriate, and he's doing the logical thing. But it means that the situation for Lewis Hamilton, as predicted, is getting worse and worse and worse all the time. Because not only is the car lacking grip, lacking this, lacking that, top speed again, but he's also annoyingly a little bit slower than his teammate. And regardless of what he may say or what others may say, I can tell you now that will eat inside him for sure. He won't like that at all. So let's get on to Mercedes now, because they've had yet another atrocious start to the weekend. And yes, they may magically get a great result in the sprint race tomorrow, but it doesn't look good. I mean, for a start, what were they doing? I mean, Q1, Lewis did a 20.4 and Q2 a 21.1. Okay, it was a fragmented Q2, but that to me didn't get the tyres up to temperature. George Russell did a 20.3 in Q1 and a 20.7 in Q2. And this at a time when, I don't know, Fernando Alonso did a 20.1 in Q1 and a 19.5 in Q2, which is about what you'd expect. Or Sergio Perez, 19.7, 19.2. I mean, for both of those drivers to go massively slower in Q2 before they brought the thing to a premature halt, and then sent them out right at the end, is, that shows that somehow they didn't get the tyres up to temperature, I would suggest, somehow. And the car's still bouncing like crazy, and it's incredibly slow in a straight line. Very slow in a straight line. I mean, this morning, when they're out on intermediates, Lewis's best speed through the trap was 234 kilometers an hour. Now, that is not an indication of where that car is aerodynamically. What that is Lewis Hamilton having to back off so early for turn, I guess it's turn 17, that he's not actually going through the speed trap flat out. And at exactly the same moment, when Charles Leclerc's doing his time, he's doing 289 kilometers an hour. Lewis, 234. I mean, it just goes on. They are so slow, the Mercedes, in every sector. It's difficult to see. I'm sure they're clutching at straws and finding some areas where they're pretty good. But let's just look at Q2 in the dry and just take, pluck, I don't know, let's just, as a thing, we'll just say Sergio Perez, sector 1, 25.1. Lewis Hamilton, 25.9. That's 0.8 in sector 1 alone against the Red Bull. The Sergio Perez Red Bull. Okay, Sergio sector 2, 27.0, Lewis 27.3. Not too bad, you could say. It's only 0.3 off. That's just only one sector though. And then Sergio 26.6 sector 3, Lewis Hamilton 27.0. 285 kilometers an hour through the speed trap, the Mercedes, when it's dry, and now they are on full throttle, against Max Verstappen, 295, and Carlos Sainz, 293. So, I mean, it is almost inconceivable that Mercedes can be so bad. But I did say at the start of the year, this is a double whammy for them, isn't it, going into 2022? Because they not only lost the Drivers' Championship in a way that should never have happened, and they gave up, I think, the legal fight far too quickly. Bearing in mind, the FIA subsequently said, yeah, many mistakes were made, and the guy that made them was fired. Which tells you quite a lot. But Lewis, nonetheless, was very gracious at the end of the race, and Mercedes said, yeah, let's just carry on, make sure it doesn't happen again. There was that. And then because they nonetheless, though, won the Constructors' Championship, they then had less CFD and wind tunnel testing time than even Red Bull, when the regulations are completely different and something like bouncing and porpoising is out there to be discovered. Although the speeds at which they run, probably they didn't see any porpoising. I'm going to be talking to a very interesting guest early next week about that. So do not miss the video early next week when we talk about what took place over the winter and what the teams were able to see or not see on CFD and wind tunnel testing. But wait for that next week. It's going to be fascinating. I can't wait to have that chat. So there we are. I'd like to finish on a sad note, sadly. I'm going to finish on a slightly sad note. We lost two very good racers this week. We lost Sid Taylor, a brilliant entrant for many years, Irish Sid. He's always very nice to me. He was one of my heroes when I was a kid. Sid Taylor Lola, Denny Holm, there he is. That's a great car, the white car with the green stripes, the shamrock. Denny and Sid Taylor, what a combination that was. That's a Lola T70 Mark IIIB. Anyway, we lost Sid. And we lost Peter Gaydon as well, who was a very, very good, elegant racing driver, Formula 3, Formula 2, very nice man as well. We used to bump into him a lot at the BRDC, and we lost Peter as well. So thoughts are with them. May their memories be a blessing. Anyway.